Well, good afternoon. I want to welcome you to this morning's Workforce Ministries event. Thank you for joining us for our first in-person meeting since the COVID pandemic a couple of years ago. So if you would this morning, would you join with me as we go before the Lord in prayer? Father in heaven, we just want to give you thanks. Give you thanks first and foremost for your grace, for your mercy, for your loving kindness. And Father, may you guide our conversation today. May you bless the words of Steve. May his words and the meditation of our heart be found pleasing in your sight. Bless our time together in our fellowship. And we just ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, Luke.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lou Giuliano, and on behalf of Workforce Ministries, I'd like to welcome you to our leadership speakers event. And I also would like to thank our hosts, the Reed Smith folks, who have provided this beautiful facility. It's very attractive to be in, and we really appreciate that. It's a real blessing to us. Anyway, for those of you who don't know, let me ask the question. Are there any folks here who have never been to a Workforce Ministries event before? Several of them. Great. Well, we welcome you especially. This is our first time back, as John said, since COVID. I think it was December 2019, last time we had an in-person meeting. Since then, we've had a couple of Zoom meetings, but it's just not the same. So we're really glad to be back. And we're really glad to have the speaker that we have today. But for those who are not familiar with Workforce Ministries, let me quickly say that we have one purpose for having these meetings, and that's to encourage believers in the workplace, to let people know that they can partake of the joy, the peace, the perseverance, and the power that the Lord provides them. No matter where they are, they can have it 24/7, whether they're at work, whether they're home, wherever they are. And what we have found over the years is so many people are hesitant to take advantage of those blessings. And what we hope to do with our Workforce Ministries efforts is to share the experience of leaders from around the country who have been able to integrate their faith in their work and let you know how they've done that, what impact it's had on them, what it means to them, and what it might mean to you. So with that, I'll go through and introduce our speaker today, and we're very, very pleased to have Steve Preston. Steve is the president and CEO of Goodwill Industries. I think their headquarters is located right around here. It's a worldwide international organization with over 115 what they call independent organizations that he has to manage, kind of like herding cats, I'm sure. But they do a tremendous job. We all know about Goodwill stores. I think there's 3,500 stores. But what we don't realize is that one of their main activities is actually workplace assistance or workplace development, providing training and opportunities for people often with disadvantage or some type of job related problem that would make it difficult to get a job. And they do a great job of placing people all over the world in doing this. So it's a very, very important factor for people who, whether through illness, addiction, or whatever the problem may be, have to find their way as a society member back into the workplace. So that's great. But one of the reasons why I was so excited to have Steve join us today is that of all the speakers we've had, he's probably had the most diverse set of experiences. I first met Steve while he was working for the CFO for ServiceMaster. And quickly after that, he went to work as head of the Small Business Association Administration for the government. Then he went to HUD. And then he went to a couple of other public companies. And I believe there's one private company in the mix as well. And now he's with a large nonprofit. So he's run the gamut. I don't know what that means other than maybe he's inquisitive, but he's had a great set of experiences and knows what it's like to work in many, many different environments. So I know that you're going to enjoy listening to him and the stories that he has. And of course, one of the keys of all those different environments is every time you move someplace, it seemed to be in a state of crisis. So that's I think where he's really demonstrated the ability of the Lord to come and help him alongside in what he's doing. So with that, I'll turn it over to Steve. Welcome.
All right, thank you, Lou. I just want to make sure that you noted that those places were in crisis when I came, not when I left, okay? So welcome back in person. I want to let all of you know I'm completely clad in Goodwill clothing today. So thank you, donors and shoppers. Those contributions go a long way in helping the people we serve, but you can find some great stuff and we definitely covet those donations. I'm here with my wife, Molly, and my son, Gib, as well, which is fun for me because when I speak, it's pretty unusual for me to have family members here. So thank you for inviting them. So, over the years, when I've had an opportunity to speak to groups, it's generally been on specific issues like policy issues or poverty or specific leadership or even leading in a crisis. But increasingly, I have found when I speak with people of faith, I find that people just kind of want to connect with other people on their journeys. And they want to talk about the decisions you made and how you made them. And I think it's because we're all just kind of looking for wisdom and for purpose and for clarity and sort of a strength of convictions as we navigate our own way through the world. So after 40 years in the workforce now, I hope that somehow the aspects of that journey can be helpful for you as I kind of go through those. In some cases, when I think about my journey, I've made moves that have not been terribly logical to the people around me. Some of them have been very dislocating. Some of them have involved risk. But it's always been with a strong conviction that God is leading me and us to a place. And it's always been with a strong sense of calling. And I was always blessed, not only in the decision that was made, but very much so during the process of discernment, the process of making that decision, which I think is very important to note, because I think it's those times of discernment, which in my case were very much many times long, that God has used that time to change my perspectives or think differently about my life, ultimately leading me to a different place than I would have been at the beginning of that. I also want to start today with a little bit of my early history. And I'm going to share that with you because it figures very specifically into where I am today. And I think often when we see people's resumes and hear their journeys, we make assumptions. So I grew up in Wisconsin. This summer was very hard for me here. And sort of in a blue collar, working class town, kind of a rough and tumble place. My parents had both grown up very poor. My father grew up in Appalachia. My grandfather was a coal miner. 9th of 11 kids in a coal mining camp, kind of a little shack. They grew up in a house where like the wallboards didn't quite fit together so you could see the light from the inside. And I have an uncle who used to say, I'm bringing you into kind of that hillbilly world, used to say, you can swing a cat by the tail and throw it outside without ever opening a window. So those are the phrases I grew up with, right? No heating, no plumbing, no electricity, frequently no shoes. And that's sort of how he was launched into the world, never finished high school. My mother grew up also in a very different situation, but also similarly facing deep challenges, at times hunger and poverty. So their lives were very limited by the lack of education and access. And although when we grew up, money was always tight. There was also kind of financial uncertainty. We knew we had what we needed, and we definitely knew it could have been a lot worse based on where they came from. It was a non-Christian family. My father grew up in a very fire and brimstone atmosphere, and he rejected faith early on in his life because of the way it was presented to him. They were very much loving parents. They were great people. They weren't paying a lot of attention to the 5 kids. We had a lot of freedom. And I had 2 older brothers that were really wild. They're kind of running loose, and 2 younger sisters. And I learned a lot early. I knew how to shotgun a beer when I was 12 years old. which as a 90-pounder at that point, I was really little. That must have been quite a sight. And I was very much heading down the same path as they were. But the summer of after my 7th grade year, I spent this summer with relatives who were people of strong faith. And that's when I really made the biggest decision of my life, which was to come to Christ. And my whole life changed, and my whole pathway changed as a result. At that point, I could see the split at that point in my life that was happening. And next June, I will have been a Christian for 50 years, which is pretty exciting for me. So I went home from that summer. My aunt called my dad, who once again was sort of, negative toward faith. She told him about the situation. She made him to commit to take me to church. I came home. I walked through the door. He said, "Your aunt called me. I know what you're going through. You're on a high. It all feels good now. It's all going to go away. But I'll take you to church. Don't ever ask me to go with you. And don't ever talk to me about it." So I pulled out a phone book as a 12-year-old. I looked at Baptist churches and I started calling pastors to interview them to see if it was the right church. And so I got a mixture of reactions, but I found one who invited me in, and that became a great sort of first step into a faith community. It was during those years that I felt very much guided and protected by God, even at a young age. And I also felt a need for very clear guidelines on how I was going to live my life in that atmosphere. And I felt very strongly also that my example for my family was essential to share my faith with them. So I invested myself heavily in school. I deepened my commitment to the church. I prayed continually for my family. When I got my driver's license, I started taking my little sisters to the church. They thankfully committed their life to God during that period of time. And it was, but there was a lot of uncertainty. And as I was preparing to leave for college, I had this incredible burden to say, God, I'm taking off. I can't make this happen anymore, right? And as I was preparing to leave for college, my parents said, well, let's think about what happened with your 2 older brothers going through high school. And let me look at what happened to you, what you went through going through high school. I want that for your sisters. So they said, we're going to take them to church when you leave. And within a year, my father had come back to the church. My brother independently in Okinawa had come to Christ through people in the military. He came back and evangelized my mother and my other brother. And within a year, all 7 of us were in the fold. So that was pretty amazing for me. It was really the first time I began to understand God's faithfulness and the way he can work in our lives. And in many ways, it was the confidence of what I saw in that situation that gave me confidence in my journey later in life. We all have stories about how we think things should happen if we're writing the script. I had a view that their spiritual well-being was on my shoulders. It wasn't about my effort, though. It was about God's faithfulness in that situation. And I realized that when God moves, I often realize how small my thinking is. And that's really been the story of my life. Sort of bigger moves than I could have ever expected and being blessed in the process. Well, I went to college. I went straight after college. I went to business school. I landed a job in an investment bank at a major Wall Street firm. I say it that way now because it was Lehman Brothers, and that doesn't sound so good anymore for people who went through the financial crisis. But at Lehman, everything kind of happened like clockwork, right? It was sort of the go-go 80s on Wall Street. I was a single guy in New York. I had sort of one foot in the faith, one foot in the world. So that was kind of a challenge at time. And I realized that in that environment, again, I needed real principles for who I was in those places and how I was going to live. And so I kind of specifically told myself a few things. I said I wasn't going to do anything for money in my future. And for me, that was a big deal for 2 reasons. Number one, it was the first time I'd ever had financial security in life. And number 2, I was on a very lucrative pathway on Wall Street. Secondly, I told myself I wouldn't do anything for prestige or position because I realized the lures of those things, especially in the environment that I was in. I realized I was in a very privileged place and I had to make the most of it. So I invested myself heavily in learning and growth. And I basically said, I will allow God to use what I've learned here for a different pathway, whatever it is, if I'm called to do something different. And I realized the need to engage in a local church. After living in New York for a number of years, I was really longing for, a deeper faith commitment to understand my path forward. And it was about that time that Redeemer Presbyterian was just getting off the ground. Many of you know Tim Keller's and have read his books. Back then it was sort of a baby church. It was still a church plant. And I began attending. It was relatively small. And Tim began to teach about how we needed to bring our entire selves in our faith. We needed to be led through God's Spirit to drive all that we do, beginning with our hearts and moving into our purpose and our motives and our goals and our commitments. And it just sort of all came together for me in that place as I thought about the context I was in and where my life was going. It wasn't about guardrails. It wasn't about rules. It was about our lives. And I grew also during that time in my understanding of God's heart for the poor and our call to serve the poor. And I spent my weekends and my volunteer time working with kids in the city. I grew to understand their needs and eventually took one of those teens from a very rough home to live with me. Molly inherited him when we got married. We got married and had a 17-year-old. So it says a lot about her. And that's when I met Molly during that time, which was probably the biggest blessing to come out of those Redeemer years. Eventually, I felt strongly that God was leading me to leave Lehman for a different path. And I went through a very lengthy process of discernment. And I realized the longer I prayed, the more God opened me up to the possibilities. And ultimately, I decided to take a financial leadership role with one of the firm's clients, whose CFO, whose partner was one of whose CFO was one of our former partners that I knew. I'd actually said no to the role earlier, but over time, it just began to make sense to me for a lot of reasons. It was also very tidy. As I mentioned, I knew the CFO. It was in the same building I was working in. Molly and I could kind of lean into our great Redeemer life and all of our friends. It was going to be really nice. And it was the day I was supposed to get an offer letter. And I looked on back then, the Quotron or the Reuters screen, and it said that the CFO was hiring me, had just resigned from the job. And I wasn't really sure what that meant. So he came back and said, had an offer I couldn't refuse. And the role just got bigger. Well, during this process, I had gone to Omaha to interview people at the largest facility of the firm. And I got back and I had told my new bride, thank God this job isn't in Omaha. Oh my gosh, I wouldn't want to live there. Which if you're from Omaha, I actually grew to love the town. And so when I talked to the CFO after he resigned, he said, the job just got bigger. It's going to be more opportunity for you, but we need to move it to Omaha. So she'd already gotten that set up, which wasn't a winner. But I also realized that through the process, I had developed a clear conviction that this was the role for me. And the Omaha switch felt like God saying to me, are you willing to go where I'm taking you? Or is this too high of a hurdle for you now? Now that I built in you a conviction that this is the right thing. There is no way I would have looked at that job if I had known that at the front end. But I felt the leading of God to be overwhelming for a lot of reasons. The Lehman folks thought I was crazy. It was about a year or so before I was coming up for partner. They offered me a great job in London. In fact, I was leaving money. I was leaving prestige. My new wife was confused a little bit by the concept. Thankfully, she was still starry-eyed after only 5 weeks of marriage. But I have to say, by following that lead, we were enormously blessed in the next dozen years of our journey. We found so much more space to build our lives together in our family. We became very involved in our communities. We had an opportunity to help launch 2 church plants along this way in the cities we lived in. And I started on a path because of that move of professional development that would uniquely qualify me for many of the challenges I had that I would have never had if I hadn't made that move. During those years, we moved to Chicago. I became the CFO of a Fortune 500 company. That's where Lou and I met each other. And later moved into a role where I oversaw a portfolio of activities that included technology and process reengineering and strategic sourcing, and kind of a lot of the operational guts of running a large company. Things were going great. We had 5 young kids. We planted a church that was kind of in full swing. The job was great. We had terrific friends. And I began to develop a strong conviction that God was leading us to a different kind of place to make a different kind of impact with our lives. And it was an overwhelming sense. And my wife and I began praying. We began considering different options. And that period of time was a good 2 years. So it wasn't a quick thing. So over that time, I got a call from a former colleague who was working in the Bush administration. And she said, would you ever consider a role in DC? The federal government, the administration is looking for people that can run operations. A lot of these agencies have big operations embedded in them. They've got big problems. And would you ever consider it? And for a lot of reasons, it all came together for me in that place. I studied poli-sci. I thought early in my career I'd go to an NGO and get a master's in policy. And I'd always been a strong believer in the importance of faith leaders in Washington. And so after a lengthy period of interviews and vetting and background checks, I was offered a role as an undersecretary in the Department of Commerce. And it was a really cool job. It was a pretty big job. It was not terribly public, which I was pretty excited about, but it was very impactful in ways that I felt I could really devote myself to. And it was really exciting to have clarity after a very long search and background process. Well, we're getting ready to make the public announcement. It was 2 weeks away. Everything was kind of in line. And I get a call from the White House, and the person on the other end of the phone says, "Are you sitting down?" Which wasn't the greatest thing after I'd just been through background checks, but I was, wasn't sure what that meant. I said, "Yeah." He said, "Everything's fine, but there's a different role," in his words, that was very important to the president, and we believe a higher calling. And that kind of rung the bell for me because this was about calling. But you don't have to take it if you don't want. We'll go with plan A. And you shouldn't take it if you don't think you can handle it, because you're going to need thick skin. Well, the job was running the SBA, and I kind of thought, well, how bad can that be? Well, many of you will remember back in 2005, our country faced the largest natural disaster in recent history, which was the destruction of New Orleans and the Gulf Coast in Hurricane Katrina. A critical part of the federal relief effort and recovery effort down there was the SBA disaster loan program, which provides funds to people to rebuild their homes and their businesses. And the home piece is a big deal. It's the government arm to help people get back on their feet. And because of the unprecedented demand in this loan program, the operations for making those loans had basically collapsed. It just was not working. And nearly a year after the storm, almost none of the funding had been delivered. And as a result, people were unable to build their lives, to build their homes, to rebuild their businesses and their communities. And I was asked to lead the agency, and my mandate was to fix the situation and get funds into people's hands to fuel the recovery. The failure was very public. 160,000 people were waiting for their loans. It was unrelenting, terrible press. There were calls for my predecessor's resignation. The SBA had the lowest morale of 31 agencies in the federal government. And people who were close to me, people in the recruiting world, other business leaders said, "Do not take this role. Everything is going right well for you. It's a bad idea." So I went from being very excited to actually pretty deflated. I'd never been a public figure before. The risk seemed high. I was taking a massive pay cut. We were moving our family with 5 little kids across the country. And I was actually kind of pretty scared. And I felt like God was taking me to a place where I said yes to Washington under one set of circumstances. And then the bar was ratcheted up. And I felt like I was hearing him say to me, are you going to go where I'm really leading you? And it was sort of undeniable to me that this was the place where I was heading. Well, I had the weekend to think about it. And that week in church, the pastor preached on Exodus 33. And that's where a passage where God was kind of commanding Moses toward the end of his journey to go forward and said, look, we're going to give the Israelites the land. We're going to conquer all these people. And here, Moses had been through all this drama with the Israelites. And he said, look, if I do this, I need you to send your presence with me because that will distinguish your people. I need you to teach me along the way so I can find favor with you and grow. And I want you to show me your glory. So Moses was in that situation, was looking for more of God in all of those ways. And I knew that I'd been led to that place, and I needed to look to him and trust in him for that journey forward. And I felt very strongly that God was not calling me to be safe. And I knew that the need that I would be serving was very great. I also want to note that when I looked at Moses' situation and mine, it sort of paled in comparison. And it was also a time when our country was sending people off to war. And finally, I had this overwhelming sense of blessing that I was going to be able to use my gifts in an area of such great need. It also, during that time, reminded me of Psalm 90, which is a passage where Moses is thinking about the end of his life. And he's looking back on it and he says, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Help us to know how finite our life is so we can make wise choices along the way. And Moses said that at the end of his life. And I thought to myself, when I get to the end of my life and I look back, what decision do I want to have made? Do I want to be the person who took a chance and answered the call or not? Even if it ended in failure. So, and again, as I entered the role, I realized I needed to lead with a set of principles, much as I had in other parts of my life that were relevant to the calling. And so to get my head around what I was being led to do, I knew I needed to lead my team and raise their sights to focus on the mission because of the horrible morale problems and the issues they faced. I needed to be a thoughtful and compelling public figure in the middle of this media storm. I needed to be a calm, constructive, and civil voice in the middle of unrelenting political rancor. Sound familiar? I had 20 congressional hearings in my first 15 months. I needed to lead with compassion and rigor at the same time because the need was so great. And I also felt very strongly that I needed to use my platform to demonstrate that I was a Christian leader in this place for a reason. Now, I want to take a little bit of a pause here, and I want to consider a passage on calling that has always just captivated me. And because I think it puts calling squarely in the midst of who we are. It's the first part of Isaiah 6. Many of you may be familiar with it. And it's where Isaiah receives a commission from God. And in this passage, he sees a vision of God in all of his glory. And I'm just going to read some of this to you. Isaiah sees this vision. He says, I saw the Lord seated on the throne, high and exalted, and the train of his robes filled the temple. And above him were seraphs with 6 wings. With 2 wings, they covered their faces. With 2, they covered their feet. And with 2, they were flying. And they were calling one to another, holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. And with the sound of their voices, the doorposts and the threshold shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Like, this is what Isaiah is seeing. And he sees this reality of like all of God's power and majesty. And when he looks at that, he thinks about himself and he says, oh my gosh, who am I relative to this? And he says, woe to me. I'm ruined. I'm a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips. My eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. So facing what he saw, he apparently thinks the next step is his destruction, right? But then something very special happens. Then one of the seraphs flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. And with it, he touched my lips and he said, see, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away. Your sin is atoned for. He's forgiven, just like that. And he's free. And he not only gets his sins forgiven, I always think it's interesting that the coals touch his lip because he says, I'm a man of unclean lips, his specific sins. He was freed of all that he was concerned about. But it's not over. Not only is he not forgiven, God takes another step and calls him. And he says, then I hear the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And I said, here am I, send me. So think of it, the creator of heaven and earth in all of his glory next to this guy who's sort of a puddle of shame and fear, thinking that his demise was assured next to this vision of glory. And then the hand of forgiveness reaches out to him and embraces him and offers him a pathway to join this sort of cosmic eternal reality that's much greater than anything he could ever think of himself. It's a pretty easy decision for Isaiah. There was nothing left to do but serve. And when I look at that and just think of my life in general, I often wonder to myself, like, am I settling for too little? Because that's what I want. I want what he saw. And so that passage to me, as I think about our calling, has always been sort of an overpowering sense of how it all fits together. Well, thankfully, God blessed our work at the SBA. In a relatively short time, we were able to restructure the operations. We doubled production. Billions of dollars made it to people relatively quickly, and it ended up really kind of energizing the recovery. And thankfully, 2 years after that point, we got the award for the most improved agency in employee morale, which was particularly gratifying for me as a leader of faith, because I think many of us as leaders feel real stewardship for the people that we see. And that was one of the things that I felt most blessed by. 2 years later, as the housing and financial crisis was mushrooming, so we went from Katrina to the financial crisis, I was asked to candidate for the HUD secretary role. And it was a remarkable time. I ultimately sat on the TARP. Many of you probably know what that is. That was the group that would invest in banks to help them survive. And we'd see one day after another, banks were coming to us for capital. We were implementing major legislation. HUD was racing to ramp its support from homeowners. It was a time of huge uncertainty. And at the beginning of that journey, before I took the job, I found myself in the Oval Office being interviewed by the president for the job. I didn't really know him. I had met him a couple of times, although I would come to know him much better over the years. And he said to me, HUD secretary, housing crisis. He said, why would you want this job? And I started to say, well, a lot of people thought I was crazy when I took the SBA job. And he said, you were, And I talked about what was in my heart and why I thought we were called to these places, because there was need. And I realized throughout the interview that it wasn't really my qualifications he was focused on, because those had been vetted. He wanted to know who I was, and he wanted to know my heart and why I was serving. So during that period of time, he said, well, how'd you meet your wife? And I told him about Redeemer and Tim Keller. And he said, that's the guy that preached the 9/11 sermon when I was in New York. I said, that guy's a great preacher. And after that interview, I gave him a copy of The Reason for God, which was Tim's real first book as he began publishing pretty actively. President read it twice. He had Tim to the White House to discuss the book and what it meant for his situation. He became a committed reader of his books over the years, which he's consistently mentioned to me over the years. I don't know what the specific impact of that was on him or his decisions, and I don't need to know. What I do know is I believe in that place, because of where I was, because of the position I had the opportunity to share that with him and allow God to use it in whatever way he would. I want to make another point about that time. You may have kind of drawn this thread already, but God had prepared me for those roles very, very specifically based on the journey I'd been on. I had developed experience understanding financial markets and securitizations, which was huge for the mortgage crisis. I had built financial management skills. I understood credits. I understood the financial markets, both from my CFO and banking experience. I had developed skills in operational reengineering and technology, which was essential for the SBA role. And when I went into the SBA, I developed crisis management, media, congressional relations experience that was absolutely essential in the HUD role. Everything, every day in those roles, I drew from experience that I had over those prior 25 years. And I leaned on faith to help me in those places. I left the government with that transition. I ran 2 private equity-owned businesses. Ultimately, I decided again that I wanted to make a different kind of impact in life. I felt a strong leading from God's Spirit that there was something different ahead of me. And I I migrated heavily to sort of my history in terms of where that conviction was coming from. I mentioned earlier that I'd worked a lot with kids in the neighborhoods of New York as a single guy. Well, throughout my time at DC, especially at HUD, which deals with a lot of poverty issues, I developed a much deeper awareness of what happened to those kids when they didn't move forward in the right direction and what their lives forward looked like, based on whether it was their life factors, poor decisions they made, or the compounding issues they faced over time, which just made their lives more difficult. I had begun dedicating my volunteer time to organizations that work with adults facing various challenges to help them get the skills and supports that they need to move into the workforce. And perhaps most powerfully during that period of time, my own family history came into play, because I had seen very clearly the way that the lives of my parents and my extended family were limited by the lack of education, the lack of opportunity, and how my life was very different, and how education and opportunity had opened up avenues for me that I never realized existed. And all of those things came together, and I decided to write myself a personal mission statement. And that personal mission statement went like this. It was to lead and grow a company whose stated mission is to help develop and employ people, to help difficult to employ people flourish, grow, and find economic livelihood, transforming their lives and helping to improve the lives of their families and their communities. So I wrote that down, and over the next year and a half, I began praying a lot. I began looking a lot. Molly and I were huge partners in this, as we always have been. And I received a call from Korn Ferry asking me to look at the Goodwill job. Goodwill is the largest nonprofit in North America providing workforce development services. We serve 1 million people a year in that area. We've been doing it for 120 years. That is the mission of Goodwill. That's what's behind this store. 80% of the people we serve have a high school degree or less. Tens of thousands are people who've come out of incarceration, who've had addiction issues, who've had all sorts of other challenges. And the job description that I was being offered was the mission statement I'd written for myself 18 months before that. It was remarkable, or I would say providential. It all came together for me. It took me back to my people. It took me back to my government service, especially at HUD, to those kids I worked with. And I just had this overwhelming sense, again, of God's providence in a way that I could have never engineered if I'd thought about it myself. So I just want to make a couple of concluding thoughts, kind of pull some things together. Many times during my life, especially as I faced more challenging and more complex situations, I felt the need to have a set of intentional principles to live by. And those principles needed to be rooted in my faith and specifically informed by Scripture. And of course, relevant to the situation I was in, because the situations in life change. Whether it was climbing the ladder or raising a family or serving in a community or leading publicly, it's clear that there's scriptural wisdom to support those journeys, and I needed to be very clear about how I was leaning onto those. And when I've leaned onto those principles and those convictions, I have found that I have been much better able to live freely and purposefully with conviction because of the confidence that gave me, to see opportunities in life that I wouldn't have pursued otherwise, to persevere in a lot of dark places, which you never hear about in these talks, and to allow God to work with my own rough places and my own weak places in my life as I work through those. And so that's number one, is sort of this concept of sort of principles for living based on where we are. Number two, I believe that as Christians, we're called to be God's people in all aspects of our lives, our work, our families, our relationships, our finances. And I have to confess that I really don't love the phrase, I don't know, this might tweak a lot of people, integrating our faith in our work, or integrating our faith with something else, because it feels like we're talking about equivalent realms. And we're figuring out how to kind of wedge them together, right? I believe there is one source that captures us and guides us, and everything we do needs to be derivative of that source. And that's how we are changed in these places. And finally, I will say that I think God has a plan for every one of us. If we seek his purpose in our lives, rooted in his wisdom, we will flourish, I think, in ways that we can never imagine. And we will have much more strength and much more joy in the journey side of that wisdom. I'm always reminded of that passage in Ephesians where it says, we're God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God has prepared in advance for us to do. So knowing that and seeking that purpose changes us and it changes our lives. So I think I have some time for questions. Is that right, Lou? I know I put a lot on you here.
No, we'll open the floor for questions. Thank you
Great.
very much, Steve.
Great.
That was, I think everybody will agree that was encouraging and inspiring. It's an amazing story.
Thank you.
Even though I've spent some time with you over the years, I just never heard the whole version like that. So appreciate that. But, any questions? Anybody got any questions? Where's John? There's there. No, not a single question. Everybody has a life like that. Let me get the mic to you.
I'd also say, don't hesitate. If you guys need to leave, you won't hurt my feelings. I know everybody's got jobs here.
So my question is, Goodwill is not a nonprofit that a lot of people know to be rooted in Christian faith at all. Is that intentional, or
So Goodwill is not a faith-based ministry. It is secular. It is a nonprofit. It was started out of the Methodist Church 120 years ago, and it used to be, it was expanding. They were, Methodist churches that would start the local Goodwills. But in the 30s or 40s, they split away from the Methodist Church and no longer had their kind of faith-based mission. What I would tell you is throughout the network, there are many people of faith leading, and they very much do so out of a faith commitment. But we're similar to other large nonprofits in that way, like the YMCA or others. There are some that are still faith-based. Habitat's still faith-based.
So as you look back over your seasons of careers and the changes that you feel God's called you to, do you happen to look ahead? Like, do you have a sense for the season, like how long the season's for and things like that?
I do a lot. Last month I was officially in the workforce for 40 years. A lot of my friends are retiring. And I just can't see it stopping. When I look ahead, I don't know what I'll have to give or what the right place will be, but I know I kind of want to leave it all in the field, right? And that's very much how I think. It's not how I think every day. A lot of days where I think I want to leave this tomorrow. But I think a lot about where can we be relevant as we get older, and what does that mean, and how do we serve most effectively? Arthur Brooks, many of you probably know, used to run AEI. He's at Harvard now. Is a person who writes a lot about this stuff, and he really does. He has this great article in the Atlantic about maybe a year or 18 months ago that talked about as we get older, our what we have to give changes. Like, we're not as sharp kind of with the financial numbers or with some other things, but the wisdom we build and our ability to offer that in relevant places grows significantly. And he talks a lot about migrating into those places and being able to contribute productively based on where you are in life and specifically what you have to give. So I think about it all the time, and I don't really think in terms of an endpoint, although I know at some point somehow that'll happen. I do feel the clock ticking louder. There's no doubt about it. I think when you're younger, you have this sort of expanse of a career ahead of you, and when you're older, it's sort of like there's just not that much time left. What to do? Yes, sir.
Hey, not to put you on the spot, but probably won't be the first time. I'm just interested in any examples of people who were like your employees or other leaders around you that were influenced by, you could tell you had an impact on their life in some way, where they took off in some direction, or they let you know that you had made a difference in their life?
Yeah, both faith-based people and people who are not. I think whenever I've gone into an organization, one of the huge blessings I've had is being able to move and bring a set of skills that were really, really relevant to the place. And I've often felt that going in, as Lou mentioned, I've gone into a lot of crises, getting in there and painting the vision and rallying the teams and putting structures in place to fix the problems. A lot of people have said to me, leading through that with rigor and purpose at the same time, we brought a certain character to it, help them later in their career, which for me is very humbling because I'm not the easiest guy. I'm a tense guy, tightly wound. And so that always makes me happy. On the Christian side, I have found a lot of people of faith when I have led as a person of faith, have found like a lot of confirmation is the wrong word. They have sort of felt like it was okay for them. People have had a sense of confidence or reassurance that if I'm out there on that faith and they knew that I was a person of faith, it was okay for them to live their faith. And I've had people come to me and say, well, gosh, would you lead a Bible study for us? Or I've had, receiving lines of people and people saying, I know you're a believer. and I think in a world that is so hostile to faith, being able to do that publicly in ways is really important for people who feel like they can't, like they're living in a box. And that's not what we're called to do, right? We're called to be salt and light. And so that's been reassuring. And I guess the big thing for me in all of that, and I'll say this all the time, I'm always amazed that to see God work through believers who are imperfect people. And I think a lot of times we feel like, oh my gosh, I'm not great over here, or, I'm not the best example with this. What I find is, God works with you in those places to refine those challenges, and at the same time can lead through you in ways that you wouldn't think otherwise.
Another question? I have one. Steve, you've used the expression a couple of times, as I've led as a person of faith. What does that mean? How does that get expressed?
It is not, let me give you an example. This is probably the most recent example. 2021 was probably one of the most difficult years of my career, leading Goodwill, believe it or not, nonprofit. A lot of challenges, a lot of difficult personality issues, very difficult in the middle of COVID. At the same time, we're driving through a massive transformation, down 40% in headcount. It just was a brutal year. And as I mentioned, we're not a faith-based organization, and a lot of the leaders in the network are specifically not faith-based, right? And so I had an opportunity to address the entire network in February, and it was a remarkable time of just spiritual refinement for me. And I thought a lot about leaving the job for a lot of reasons. A lot of people thought I would. And I got up there and I gave a speech and I said, look, I know we don't all come from the same faith base. Many of you know I'm a person of faith. And what I'd like to do is share with you my difficult journey over the last year and how I have leaned on principles of my faith to get me through it. And hopeful, irrespective of where you are in terms of your faith, hopefully you can garner something from that. And I talked about a handful of principles that had gotten me through. I talked about the place of like rancor and difficulty, how important I knew that I needed to be a person who loved others as myself. And that if I didn't really live that way, I wasn't who I thought I was. I talked about how important it was for me to reroute in God's love for the poor and the place that we all have in serving the poor in relevant ways that help them reach different futures. And I talked a little bit about a couple of other things. And finally, I said, and I've leaned into, I've leaned into God's call for us to persevere in times of difficulty, and how we grow, and how that's how we're refined. And if we do it in the right way with humility, we can come out stronger at the other end. And so, and it was sort of, and I kind of wove it in a way to say, I started out during times in the year saying, is this just Is this just too much? Is it just not worth it? And I ended the speech saying, I realize it really is worth it. It is worth it for us to drive through difficulties, for us to lead in love, for us to recommit ourselves to the poor, because at the end of the day, that's what we're about. And we have to work through those things if we're going to serve effectively. And so it was sort of right out there. I'll also tell you, when I was at the SBA, a group of people asked me to lead some Bible studies, which I did. I told them I can't invite people, I'm fine if you invite people, I can't manage it, and when I was going through my confirmation process at HUD, I got a letter from the Senate saying we want to understand these activities to see if you run afoul of any issues with, forcing your faith on people and separation of church and state or whatever it was. So it actually became right in the middle of it. Luckily, I had a very savvy head of legislative affairs who uncovered a proclamation that Bill Clinton had made that encouraged people of faith to express it in the workplace and allowed them to use the workplace to be able to do that. So, which was kind of curious, but anyway, that's probably the most recent example, and yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes, right here.
Hi, I want to ask how you recommend us believers responding to the constant woke agenda being pushed within businesses, completely against our values as Christians.
Yeah, that's a really hard one. The first thing I would say, and we live in a world of just sort of both sides coming together, going after each other in anger, right? I made the joke recently that, we can't hear other people because we're screaming so loud. And I think many of us are represent that. I think a couple of things. I think when you look at the cores of our faith, the tenets of our faith, we're to come to others with humility, love, have this, the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, right? We see who we're supposed to be in all places. And I think we have to have confidence that who we are as people who care about others, who live our lives in a particular way, who aren't accusatory, et cetera, there's something pretty powerful about that. And I don't think we can be frightened of that. I also think we have lived in a charmed existence in this country. And if you look at the history of Christendom, and if you look at the rest of the world, we have believers that really are really openly persecuted. And so I don't think we should think of this as being like unusual. I think what we've enjoyed for many years is unusual, and it's been wonderful. And then the third thing I would say is when we're faced with issues, I think we kind of have to we have to enter those places very gracefully. I think we're seldom asked to say, do you agree with it or do you disagree with this? And what's your political position? And I understand that can feel like a wedge in the workplace. I don't think it's a problem to say, look, these are things I'm not comfortable with, right? My faith is really important to me. And, but when you get to that point where you're kind of, part of the battle in the workplace, it gets very complicated. I have that. I saw a communication that came out from my employee engagement team that I couldn't believe it came out. And I said to myself, am I going to put a stake in the ground on this? How am I going to do this? And am I going to express opposition to it? And I said, it's out there. This is where people are. I'm going to take a different pathway, and I'm going to work to bring the communications that we put out there under my leadership, make sure I have approval of them before they go out, guide people to what I think is more aligned with our values, more inclusive of everyone, and use my influence to guide it to a different place without saying that's wrong. Now that's my view, but lead with love, lead on who we're supposed to be as believers in Christ in terms of how we love people and treat them and enter them. And it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard to be accusatory towards somebody that everybody says, my gosh, look at who that person is.
Steve,
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. This has been great. Appreciate it.
Let me once again thank you for an inspiring, encouraging, just exciting representation of living out in the workplace. And I think it's as I said, it's a real encouragement to all of us. It's we don't have to demand adherence to a faith, but we can each one of us can create a faith-friendly environment. And that's all you need to do. That's what David Miller's line, right? Is faith-friendly is all we can ask for and all we can hope for, and all each of us can participate and bring about. But let me bring you over here and ask everybody to join us in a closing prayer. Lord, we thank you so much today for Steve and his family being here to represent you in his life, the influence that you've had over him, and the power that you've given him to be able to do things that other people couldn't, to be able to do things that you wanted him to do. We thank you for his faithfulness to you, his willingness to, each time there was a turn, to turn to you and to seek your guidance and wisdom. We ask that you continue to watch over them, bless them, keep them well, and allow his work for you to continue in whatever way you will lead him tomorrow. We also thank you and ask for your blessings over the people that are here, both here in person and or watching over the live stream, that you may be with them all and encourage them as they go on to continue their lives and work. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.